Good afternoon, folks. It's Allison in the Little Rock rented kitchen. I just wanted to take a few minutes because I really need to take a break and go outside because the last couple of days I've been really spending a lot of time chunking out two talks. One was the Ian Carroll, Nicole Shanahan interview, so I created a playlist for that, and then I created another playlist for a recent Lex Friedman podcast with this woman, Sarah Walker, who's an astrobiologist at Arizona State University. And both of those talks, I felt like there were lots of bits of information that I wanted to sort of lay out for people and keep them as mental notes to sort of mix and match in my quilting of these ideas. So I've been spending entirely too much time inside the last 3 days, but I finally got that done. And I'm sure that people who are subscribed to my channel are maybe annoyed with me because I keep sending notifications maybe for 1 minute or 30-second or 3-minute clips, but that's the way I organize information. Apologize in advance if I have annoyed you on that. If you find it too annoying, just unsubscribe and manually check in on me every now and then. Those two playlists are up, and I highly recommend you checking them out. I've organized the clips themselves too. Initially, they're uploaded just as sort of I've gone through the video, but the playlist itself is reorganized not chronologically from the video itself and more thematically. So even if you've maybe listened to those interviews or podcasts, even if you go to the playlist on your laptop usually, because I think the phone sort of shortens the titles, but you can scan through the titles and see where my headspace is and what are the ideas that I was most interested in. I've been working, before I took time out to do these couple of videos, I have these really detailed notes that I've been trying to do an updated version of my thinking as has been informed by myself and our collective sort of shared distributed intelligence brain with text-based collaborators and bringing things up to date. The work that Sean and I did on the micro and mycobiome, as well as revisiting some of Steffer's early works with the engineered nanoparticles. So I started that, and then I really didn't get it done because I think I was supposed to actually spend some time on particularly this Sarah Walker information. The reason this really stood out to me, because I know there's innumerable podcasts. I don't know how often Lex Friedman does them. I don't really keep track of this. This is something that someone shared with me. And again, I don't always consume all the information that comes my way, but this was really helpful. So thank you to the person who sent it. There was an interesting sync for me. And as I've mentioned before, my interaction with these sort of information fields seems to happen through engaging with the landscape, both the natural landscape and the built environment, including art. And so I ended up going down to Hot Springs early in the week and putting a deposit check down on a little house that I'm buying. And then I had the rest of the day. And since I had sort of made this commitment, it looks like Hot Springs is where I'm going to definitely be. I ended up deciding to go to a botanic garden that's on Lake Hamilton, which is at the southern end of Hot Springs. It's a largely developed lake. These are all reservoirs on the Washita River that comes down. So Lake Washita is a really big lake, and it's all Army Corps land around and very little development other than campgrounds and a few resorts. And then Lake Hamilton is very developed with a lot of very fancy homes and condos and things. And then there's Lake Catherine, which is a smaller lake, and it has some state park land and a little bit of development. It's nice to be by all this water. So this botanic garden was two sort of fingers into Lake Hamilton, again, reservoir lake. And it was land that was originally clear cut for lumber in the 1920s. If you look on a map of Arkansas, between Little Rock and Hot Springs, it kind of goes sort of to the southwest from Little Rock down to Hot Springs, and that's Route 30. And south of Route 30, or sort of south and east of Route 30, is more pine. Longleaf pine, and a little bit more open, a little bit more going towards the delta, and more agricultural. And then further up, it's a lot more national forest. And so there's a powerful interest in the lumber industries going back to the early 20th century in this corridor, and a lot of it is concentrated sort of south of I-30. So yeah, so this botanic garden had been lumbered, and there was a woman who took over from her father, and he had died in a car crash. And so she ran this lumber company, the Arkansas-Wisconsin Lumber Company, and also a brick company, because Malvern, Arkansas, which is maybe 20 minutes east of Hot Springs, was known as like the brick capital of the world. So she ran sort of these two companies, was married. She remarried to an influential New York family by the last name of Garvin, and the father-in-law of her second husband was a very influential person in chemistry, and he helped run the Chemical Foundation and establish the field of chemergy, so CHEMURGY, which, as I'm looking now into sort of the history of chemergy in the teens and 20s and 30s, is essentially repurposing agricultural production for other chemical compounds. And it's sort of like the basis of biotechnology and the bioeconomy. And sort of knowing that in the context of the lumber industry and how a lot of agricultural quote unquote waste is being repurposed for biotech in the name of circular economy and sustainability, a lot of that is also linked to graphene. And the University of Arkansas is doing a lot of graphene research because there's a fair amount of waste related to the poultry industry and the timber industry, and also there's rice processing industries. So there's a lot of, surprisingly, graphene research in Arkansas, and Stepher's actually pointed to me that in Little Rock, there's a whole graphene research center, as well as on the highway between Little Rock and Hot Springs, there's a standalone Arkansas Heart Hospital with very brand new LED lighting, big blue LED lights on it. And this isn't coming out of the University of Arkansas, but there's other biomedical research, fairly recent, that they're developing pacemakers that utilize graphene and light-based pacemaker sensing. And so I still need to get around to talking with Sean about Julian Gresser and the big heart intelligence and how the heart torus field, I think, is linked to collective manifestation. But there's a lot of these moving pieces going on that's the backdrop of my visit to this botanic garden. And so the woman, her second husband died in the 70s, and they were going to build a house on this land on the lake, and that didn't happen, even though she had planted a lot of things. And then by the late 80s, early 90s, she transferred it to the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, landscape art department that still administers it. And that landscape architecture department is affiliated with E. Fay Jones, a gentleman who was trained under Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin and did a lot of sort of prairie-style architecture in Northwest Arkansas and the Ozarks. What is particularly known for these sort of forest chapels made of natural materials and glass and stone and wood, including there's a chapel. He didn't actually do this chapel. It was done by his colleague, but E. Fay Jones collaborated with Mrs. Garvin of Garvin Woodland Gardens, this botanic garden, in the early 90s to create this outdoor pavilion, which has some really interesting, it's wooden shake, it's a rounded pavilion, and then it goes up, and then it's open at the top, and it has glass and metal that looks a lot like sacred geometry. So there's this pavilion, and then there's an Anthony Chapel, which is by the colleague of Mr. Fay Jones in that style, which is used for weddings, a very open glass, woodsy kind of chapel. And then that was funded by the Anthony family, another lumber family. And then the Anthony family also funded the creation of a carillon, which are these 8 tall piers, maybe 30 feet high, made of copper, so like pretty pricey, in a very modernistic sort of prairie style. And it's digital. This carillon doesn't have real bells. It's mechanical. And at the top, there's this sort of octagonal star-shaped metal formations. And it's on a plaza in a patio, and it's not really clear. It's kind of tucked away in the woods what is actually going on. And I look at that and I'm like, that looks like technology. That looks like some sort of programmable acoustic technology in the woods. Put this all against the background of the work that Sean and I and Steffers have been looking into around fungal economies, fungal root woodlands, and all of this stuff going on. Anyway, so I go to Garvin Woodland Gardens and I, sign up as a member because it's about, I don't know how many, 250 acres, to walk all of the paths. It's, 2 or 3 miles. So it's not huge, but it's definitely like a nice place. It was a little bit more Longwood Garden-y. I'm not a big colorful planting bed person. My preference is really sort of mixed perennial borders and native plants and things like that. And there was a little bit of that. It was a little bit more, lots of coleus and caladiums and mass plantings of things, which, I don't get super excited about. But that was it's neither here nor there. That's just my personal taste. So I go in and I see the big round pavilion and I make my way over to the children's garden because, again, I've been very interested in the forest schools and the children and their interfacing with fungal forest environments, right? And so on the way to this treehouse, there was a little path with fences and it had fairy houses. And I like a good fairy house, all natural materials. And again, we're in the middle of quartz crystal land. So there's lots of quartz integrated and crystals and glass, and there's a fence. So the kids can't really play with the fairy houses, but they can look. And of course the adults really like them too. And it was a little strange because they had the fairy chapel and the tooth fairy's house, but then they had the honeymoon suite, which is a little bit odd for kids, and the parents are like, oh, that's where they make more fairies. That's the fairy factory at the honeymoon suite. And I'm like, well, that's a little kundalini. I don't know why you'd need that for a children's garden, but okay. So I make my way through, and then there's a big boulder field, which again has been set up in the landscape, but it's somewhat natural because that area along the lake is rocky and it has watersheds and water features that go down to the lake. So it's boulders and creeks, and then animal sculptures by this guy, Tim Cherry, I think, who's based in Branson, Missouri. He's Canadian, but now he's based in Branson. And so they're very traditional sculptures. A great blue heron or an otter or a rabbit or a goose. And they were nice, they were cute, but they weren't particularly encoded. And so then I got to this large project called the Treehouse. And the Treehouse, so the Treehouse it's not attached to any trees. Essentially, it's a modernistic form. It was built in 2018 and 2019. It cost $1.8 million, so pretty big chunk of change for a small town botanic garden. It's 113 pine ribs with a couple of structural steel supports. It's 3 levels. And the openings that overlook, so there's a bridge, a raised walkway that goes to it. And it overlooks a patio. And it says this entire treehouse is focused on teaching children about dendrology, which is a complex system, right, of flow mechanics. But there's really no interpretive panels talking about flow or dendrology, and there's really nothing written anywhere. It's just experiential. And so it's over on the second level of this rounded shape made out of pine ribs, sort of gridded. There are laser cut screens that are like venation, but also Voronoi patterns, which Steffers has talked a lot about AI pathway planning. And you overlook a patio that has dendrological stones, like river stones cut into it. And then there's a small creek that goes along and with boulders. And then in this creek, evidently, maybe once a week, the kids can play in the creek. And there are these strange beach balls that are attached, like globes and rainbow beach balls and ones with golden glitter in them. And there was a watermelon one. But it's kind of a muddy creek. And to me, it seems like there weren't signs saying the kids shouldn't play in the creek, although there were definitely areas that were cordoned off. It didn't say that you could play in the creek. It didn't say you shouldn't play in the creek. It was kind of unclear how you were supposed to engage with the creek, but it was full of these beach balls, which to me felt a little bit like encoding and photonics there. And then the bridge that goes to the treehouse at one of the border gateways from the main path to the path that goes to the structure, which is, again, like a horn. It's sort of bent, and it's smaller in one end, and then it widens up, and it looks very organic, almost like a horn or a cocoon. It's an organic sort of twisty shape, and I'm assuming that's to go around the existing trees. And so at the threshold is a representation of a tree, but it's digital and, again, laser cut in black metal, and it looks like a punch card. So it looks very computational. So all of this is nature, but man-designed, man-engineered, and installed into a natural environment, ostensibly to teach children about dendrology and complex systems in the forest, but there's really nothing educational about it. And so most people would simply just walk into the space, check out the view, and then leave, because there's not a whole lot in there. There are some levels. You could sit there if you wanted to, but there's not a real reason, unless there's programming there, to go in there and sit. And then at the second level, there was a sculpture. So this is where I want to tell you a little bit about the sculpture. Okay, so if you've seen my latest blog post, one of the things I talk a little bit about is going to the Mount Holly Cemetery in Little Rock and seeing these tombstones for that were in the shape of tree stumps that are connected to this Woodman of the World, which was a fraternal organization founded by a Freemason in Omaha, Nebraska in the 1890s, and evolved into a ginormous life insurance company that currently is privately held. It has $17 billion in assets and all of these different members. And evidently, at some point in the 1920s, almost all of the influential politicians and legislators and judges in the state of Texas were members of Woodmen of the World, to the point that there was some sort of real estate legal situation in El Paso that went to the state Supreme Court. And all of the people involved had to recuse themselves because they were all members of that organization. And so they had to essentially create a temporary Supreme Court judiciary of women, because it was a fraternal group and there were no women. Of course, it was probably women who were married to the men who had an interest in it. But there's even a Wikipedia entry on this female state Supreme Court justice in the 1920s in Texas, because they were all involved. And so one of the members, in addition to the fact that the guy who revived the Ku Klux Klan was a member of Woodmen of the World, there was also a gentleman who was a Texas senator by the last name of Shepherd, and he was the one who initiated prohibition, but then he also initiated the founding of federal credit unions. And so when I was looking into early blockchain identity, I was really kind of surprised that it was the credit unions that were doing the earliest blockchain identity systems. And now I can see that the shift is going to be towards community banking, because the signal they wanted embedded in the community. And so there's a consistency now around the blockchain identity and federal credit unions and why that would be. But I think it's quite interesting that this was coming out of Texas. And again, it was national legislation, knowing that moving forward, all these generations later, it's Texas that is one of the leaders in the blockchain space in developing blockchain for liberty, even though, the former director, Natalie Smolensky of the Texas Blockchain Council, her background is in phenomenology and psychiatry. So that's all very interesting. So I go in, it's just me, to the second level of this treehouse, quote unquote treehouse. It's really just this oval horn, engineered modernistic horn thing. And in it is a sculpture that looks kind of like a Woodman of the World gravestone. It's maybe 3 feet high, and it's a tree. It's not exactly a stump because it's sort of taller than it is wide. Usually stumps are sort of short and stocky, but it's a cut off tree that's supposed to look like a basin. And you might think it was a water fountain or something, but there was a little spigot on the side, but it was tiny. So it was maybe like 1.5 inches. So it was not really functional, and there was a little hole in the basin. So it was clearly about fluidics. And this was all bronze and cast into the structure of the tree trunk, into the bark, going up the side towards the little spigot that was non-functional, are these little pipes. And they were offset, so you really noticed them, even though they were very thin, like straws. And to me, again, fluid dynamics, and this represents, I think, the xylem, right? The water and the mineral nutrients going up and down the tree, and that's the flow state. And across the pipes, there is a salamander. Now, the salamander is an alchemical symbol of the soul, and it's also sort of transformative. And then at the base was a group of acorns, and one of them was sprouting into an oak sapling with 4 oak leaves, and there was a key in it. So the key, and then it was sitting on a group of gears. And so I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, well, and then the other significant things on the side are there were several snails that were embedded, which has to do with like the Fibonacci series and also chirality, which is something that came up in the Sarah Walker discussion and something that Steffers has looked into quite a bit in terms of sort of origins of life and these mirror images and choice theory. I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, okay, so the father-in-law of the woman who deeded these lands was the founder of Chemergy, which is essentially the foundations of the biotechnology movement, right? And so we've got the oak tree and the acorn and the beginning of the oak, which is entelechy, which is this idea from a very small compressed blueprint, you could create something enormous, right? And then you have encryption because you have a key into the acorn. And so it seems to me like that's not a typical thing that you put in a children's statue. And again, as I had walked through, there was a sculpture garden of other animals. And these other animals did not have this level of puzzling involved. They were just simply like a lovely to look at otter. You know, it's dynamic, but there was no encryption going on other than maybe you could come up with a symbol of what the otter meant beyond that it was a creature of the local biosphere or something like that. But it didn't have these puzzle clues in it, right? Of the flow state of the salamander, of entelechy, which again, these morphic fields, the encoded information, which goes back to Levin. And then at the top of the basin was perched a squirrel. Now, this whole playground was called an adventure playground. And there was even a sign sort of to the effect of like, oh, there's some rough edges on these rocks. You know, be careful with the kids. This is, you know, an adventure playground. And so the squirrel was represented as an adventurer. And later on, I was looking at it came out of the Ring studio, Nick Ring in Greenville, South Carolina. And it's interesting because I kind of had a run-in with an IEEE standardization for the spatial web guy, Lee Stogner, who is also based in Greenville, South Carolina. And Greenville, South Carolina is a smart city. And I'm not saying the Rings know anything about IEEE or smart cities or anything like that, but it's interesting because later on in this discussion of autocatalysis or autocatalytic systems, Sarah Walker talks about molybdenum as being a ring, an autocatalytic ring. So the ring thing really struck me. It's an adventurous squirrel, and in one of the Instagram posts, the Ring Studio said, "Oh, he's a mountaineer. He's a mountaineer." And then further down, there's another sculpture with a cardinal, and the cardinal is an explorer of the valleys or something. So it's sort of high and low. And the squirrel has a satchel, and the satchel is secured with a peg and a key. And so again, we're talking about encryption, and he's got acorns with him. And so we're thinking, part of what really resonated for me in terms of encountering this puzzle statue, and then encountering this video with Lex Friedman that someone had forwarded to me, is that in Sarah Walker's discussions, she talks a lot about us as sort of being deep in time and having these deep lineages that we're connected to.
But I think the idea of this object that in it contains all the information about the history of an entity that you see now, just trying to visualize that is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the mind breaks down quickly as you step seconds and minutes back in time. But
for sure.
I guess it's just a gigantic object.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be thinking about.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is one of the reasons that we have such an ability to abstract as humans, because we are so gigantic that like the space that we can go back into is really large. So like the more abstract you're going, like the deeper you're going in that space.
But in that sense, aren't we fundamentally all connected?
Yes. And this is why the definition of life cannot be the individual. It has to be these lineages because they're all connected, they're interwoven, and they're exchanging parts all the time.
Yeah, so that maybe there's certain aspects of those lineages that can be lifelike. They can be characteristics that can be measured, like with the assembly theory, that have more or less life. But they're all just fingertips of a much bigger object.
Yeah, I think life is very high dimensional. And in fact, I think you can be alive in some dimensions and not in others. Like if you could project all the causation that's in you, in some features of you, very little causation is required, and like very little history. And in some features, a lot is. So it's quite difficult to take this really high dimensional, very deep structure and project it into things that we really can understand and say, like, this is the one thing that we're seeing, because it's not one thing.
And to me, that makes us feel like acorns, right? That we have this encoded information, and that the power of that deep history that leads up over the eons from the Big Bang all the way up to like we show up on the scene gives us great power in making choices about the futures that happen.
Yeah, so I think if you're thinking about this sort of thinking about living things as these giant causal structures or these objects that are deep in time, the fact that we have a conscious experience is because we are these temporally extended objects. So consciousness and the abstraction that we have in our minds is actually a manifestation of all the time that's rolled up in us. And it's just because we're so huge that we have this very large inner space that we're experiencing that's not, and it's also separated off from the rest of the world because we're the separate thread in time. And so our consciousness is not exactly shared with anything else because nothing else occupies the same part of time that we occupy.
Well, then if consciousness is merely temporal separateness, then that comes before life.
It's not merely temporal separateness. It's about the depth in that time. The reason that my conscious experience is not the same as yours is because we're separated in time. The fact that I have a conscious experience is because I'm an object that's super deep in time. So I'm huge in time. And that means that there's a lot there that I am basically, in some sense, a universe onto myself because my structure is so large relative to the amount of space that I occupy. I think there's a horizon, and I don't know how to articulate this yet. It's a little bit like the horizon at the origin of life, where the space inside a particular structure becomes so large that it has some access to a space that's not, that doesn't feel as physical. It's almost like this idea of counterfactuals. So I think like the past history of your horizon is just much larger than can be encompassed in like a small configuration of matter. So you can like pull this stuff into existence. This property is maybe a continuous property, but there's something really different about human level physical systems and human level ability to understand reality. What I can also say is like what intelligence is in this framework. So you have these objects that are large in time. They were selected to exist by constraining the possible space of objects to this particular, like all of the matter is funneled into this particular configuration of object over time. And so these objects arise through selection. But the more selection that you have embedded in you, the more possible selection you have on your future. And so selection and evolution, we usually think about in the past sense, where selection happened in the past. But objects that are high density configurations of matter that have a lot of selection in them are also selecting agents in the universe. So they actually embody the physics of selection and they can select on possible futures. And I guess what I'm saying with respect to consciousness and the experience we have is that there's something very deep about that structure and the nature of how we exist in that structure that has to do with how we're navigating that space and how we generate that space and how we continue to persist in that space.
And I was just like, oh my gosh, like she's sort of imagining us as giant time crystals. And I'm looking at the acorns and I'm thinking this is the embodiment of the time crystal, right? And again, we're speaking to children because children, and the elderly are the ones who are sort of closer to the field and intuitively have this knowing. Like they don't need to have an interpretive sign to say exactly what this is. They might just know or not. I don't know. Maybe I'm one of the weirdos that has the only kind of brain that would think this way. So anyway, I thought that, wow, we've got flow. We have dendrology, which is a complex systems. We have microfluidics. We have the Fibonacci and the chirality in the snail. We have the soul alchemy in the salamander. And then we have biotechnology because it's sitting on gears, right? And then next to it is a seat. It's sort of a twirly seat that's an upside down pine cone, which again is fractal, that's also imprinted with gears. And so there's a very clear intention. They called it steampunk. I think it was called the steampunk squirrel. But I think steampunk is, again, hearkening to the Victorian industrial age. And then maybe there is a mirror between the steampunk Victorian age and the bioeconomy age. And while I'm sort of processing all of this, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Steffers or Sean, but they brought my attention to the fact that we were looking at, maybe it was Steffers, I think, Mica Works, which is connected to Berkeley and the Berggruen Institute, and they're making things out of this fungal fashion, like high-end fungal leather, had just opened a big factory in South Carolina, in Union, South Carolina, which is not that far from Greenville. And so again, the sensing, we are moving towards smart technologies that look organic. So then how does that change how we talk about this, which is a big part of what the Sarah Walker talks were about, was like the struggle of when we're trying to articulate concepts that we don't have mental architectures for, and we only have sort of words that have a lot of baggage to them, how do we begin to enter into conversations about these new ideas?
Meaning is the emergent property. Okay, got it.
Well, this is why you can play with language so much, actually. So words don't really carry meaning. It's just about how you lace them together.
Yeah, but from where does the...
But you don't have a lot of room. Obviously, as a speaker of a given language, you don't have a lot of room with a given word to wiggle, but you have a certain amount of room to push the meanings of words.
Yeah.
And I do this all the time, and you have to do it with the kind of work that I do, because if you want to discover an abstraction, like some kind of concept that we don't understand yet, it means we don't have the language. And so the words that we have are inadequate to describe the things. This is why we're having a hard time talking about assembly theory, because it's a newly emerging idea. And so I'm constantly playing with words in different ways to try to convey the meaning that is actually behind the words, but it's hard to do.
So you have to wiggle within the constraints.
Yes. Lots of wiggle.
That goes back to some of the conversations Jason and I were having about Stephen Newcomb's work in Pagans in the Promised Land. You know, when the original people are on the shore and they see a ship coming in, you know, with the conquistadors or, you know, the people from the West, they don't have any mental framework for what that's going to mean. They can't even engage until they have some lived experience bridging cultures, because they don't even have a frame of reference.
Those initial ships, the first ships coming toward the shore, obviously they have no understanding of the language that's being spoken by those foreigners, those invaders on those ships. When those invaders come to shore, they don't know what language they're speaking. They have no idea, sense of what their ideas are, their mentality is, or anything. And in short order, they will begin to find out through the behavior of those people. But how long will it take them or their descendants to understand the language of the invader to an extent necessary to have this kind of a conversation that we're having today?
And that's what I'm feeling right now, is like we don't even have a frame of reference. And that's, part of one of the conversations with Ian Carrollin and Colt Shanahan. They're talking about blockchain smart contracts and AI governance, and how we're just going to get rid of those old bureaucratic legacy systems. Ha ha ha, but people really don't know anything about what we're talking about, but they should, because it's important.
So when you combine blockchain with AI, you get an incredible economies of just brilliant functioning, like just clean, incredibly lean, transparent, fast, low overhead transactions.
Mm-hmm. That do exactly what you program them to do.
So I was in these circles as a lawyer, looking at, all of the legal issues surrounding them. You can program the rules, the policies into them, the clearing house requirements. It is, an incredibly elegant solution to a lot of the problems we face today, is that we have these old legacy systems running our government.
Yeah.
And they're very expensive, and they're very slow and bureaucratic, and they drive people nuts. So I am one of the first true legal AI technologists.
Maybe the first person ever to be potentially in the Oval Office with direct expertise in AI and in blockchain. Not enough people are having the conversation about how vital that is going to be to the rest of our lives.
This is mind-blowing. This is like a huge deal. And
most of the world doesn't even know the first thing about it, right?
Yeah, I guess not. I mean, they ought to.
They ought to.
Because it's transformative.
And I'm like, yes, they should. Like, we should be slowing down. Everything is speeding up. But we need to be really thoughtful about how we proceed, because we don't know enough about the consequences. So yes, the Garvins, chemergy. There's a lot of papers about the 1930s and the failure of chemergy. Now, the folks who were developing this with the Chemical Foundation, and I have to spend a little more time looking into it, because there's the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia, and I don't know if it's the same thing or if they're different or concurrent, but like Henry Ford was working with the Chemical Foundation to develop synthetic rubber for World War II, I think. And then the Chemical Foundation, I think, or Mr. Garvin was overseeing a lot of the patent work or the intellectual scientific property that came into the United States after World War II from the Nazis, right? So then there's all of that biotechnology to consider. And like, how does this interface with a children's garden and a squirrel basin? I mean, it's just very strange. But so anyway, and so then I go down a level and I noticed something I hadn't noticed on the way in was that there's a tree, a branching system against the wall. And in this branching system is a similar squirrel, only this time he has, instead of a satchel, he has a backpack and he has all sorts of mountaineering gear. And then with the squirrel, and there's prominent oak leaves there and also dogwoods, there's a cardinal. And the cardinal is in front of a nest. And to me, and the cardinal also has a backpack on and aviator goggles. So these are the adventurers. These are animal adventurers, and they're scavenging, they're foraging, and then they have something to bring things back. And it's interesting because when I was doing my work in education around the digital badging, they were always talking about backpacks. Like you need a backpack of badges. You know, you're representing yourself as badges and you put them in a backpack, or you have a data backpack that goes with you from school to your after school provider. And the backpack was a really central concept. But you've got this squirrel and this cardinal, both of which have backpacks, and they're exploring. And, you know, and the cardinal is in front of a nest. And so you think about this idea of foraging information and then bringing it back. So you've got a team of adventurers, and they go out into information space to collect things on a quest. And again, all of the behavioral programming in the schools are you know, backed by Google, and Class Dojo is that you're an avatar and you're going on gamified adventures as a part of a team, decentralized, distributed intelligence, big minds, and then you bring it back and then it's collectively processed. And so I don't really think that the rings, I actually emailed them and asked them, I said, you know, I encountered your sculpture and it was really interesting. These were the things I saw. You know, I saw biotechnology, I saw microfluidics, I saw quantum biology, which is the avian magnetoreception, which is the bird, and migration patterns, that's quantum biology. I saw, you know, the soul alchemy in the salamander. I'm seeing entelechy. I'm seeing, you know, chirality in the Fibonacci, and biotech encryption of data. Like, did you get feedback on what they wanted to see, you know, in this piece? Because this is what I saw. Like, you know, there was just a contact form and I haven't heard back yet. I don't know how much feedback they got on the nature of this particular installation because their name wasn't even on it. You know, I went online to look, and I'll include, you know, pictures of this as we go along. I think there were 2 Alamy photos, you know, with the copyright stuff all over them you could buy, but nobody really was taking pictures of these. Now, this treehouse cost $1.8 million. It's fairly recent, 2018, 2019. I came across the Interpretative Design, and if you look at their designs, they were far more naturalistic than what showed up. They didn't have aviator things on the cardinal. It was just a bird. You know, it wasn't set up as an avatar or as a character in a story. It was just nature. And so there was some change in the translation between how the initial interpretive profile was set up, which is just far more straightforward, and then this sort of steganographic imprinting that actually resulted and was installed. I think it was installed in 2019. So most of the press coverage was about just the structure itself before it had the sculptural installation. There was really not much coverage about the sculptural installation. I will say the other thing that was in the space, there are tree rounds, like pathways that were rounds of a tree trunk with time. And so to me, that is like a snapshot of a pattern across time. Those rounds of trunks represent a time encapsulated as an image, and then they were laid out like along a path, which is a sort of a cybernetic evolution through time, is sort of my take. And again, I don't necessarily think that the architects were doing that. They were just like, oh, we like, you know, tree trunk rounds as a walking path, and that's a nice visual trope. Below, you can overlook and you could see the fluidics, the complexity in the pavement. And there was a wall, and there were trees growing up, and in the wall you could see the root patterns, both a tap root and a distributed root. So the roots were big, and there were supposed to be thrones made out of actual root balls, but that didn't happen. Those weren't installed. There were some other features that weren't installed in this piece. But to me, I felt like, I go out in the world and then things tell me stories, and then they overlap with some of the narratives that I encounter in some of these talks. And so I've spent a couple of days really chunking out, and I'm going to sit and digest it more. I've been trying to write an update of my thoughts about my hypotheses, both mine and updating, and I've written like 6 pages of a blog post, and mostly it was sort of apologizing for people not understanding me, because I'm telling a story that most people don't have a framework to really plug into at this point. And then all of these notes were before the Sarah Walker conversation. So now I'm going to have to add even more to that. So someone emailed and asked, they're like, and honestly, this is kind of a silly ask, but I did respond. Your work with Sean in the latest session, can you distill it into one sentence? Which, if you know me, I'm pretty long form. So distilling anything into one sentence is kind of silly. But I did, and so I'm going to share that with you now so that it's a run-on sentence. I will say that. It's not a short and pithy sentence. I think they sort of implied, oh, it sounds like you want to plug a microbiome into a Hivemind. And again, everyone's trying to be reductive, but then once you reduce things into some small little box, it gives you a sense of control over it, but I don't think it's actually accurate. And then it's limiting, because then you live inside that little box. Is like, okay, Hivemind microbiome. And then this Hivemind, which is a big part of the conversation with Lex Friedman and Sarah Walker, was about language and the communication when it's effective and when it's fails, and how to be playful with language and how to stretch language, and then alternatives to language, whether that looks like light, whether that looks like fashion, whether that looks like other things, that Twitter is like a puzzle, and how you compress a lot of information into a small space. But I didn't find, for me, this idea, like, sure, you could say hooking a microbiome to a Hivemind, but that's not how I feel about it. And so I think, there was this expectation that somehow we'd summarize it. And I'm like, I'm not done exploring. I have this much, and other things on the back and other pieces of paper out here, and I'm not done exploring. And they kept saying, well, is it graphene and blockchain? Those are the things, right? Those are like putting words in my mouth. And I said, I don't know. It could be the I Ching. It could be none of these things, because increasingly the work that I'm seeing is that the technology is organic. So that complicates the narrative that I used to inhabit, which was nature good, technology bad, because it's blurring. It's getting blurry, intentionally blurry. This chemergy, clearly it's been blurry for close to 100 years, only I didn't know enough to know how murky it was, but it is. And Berggruen is looking at that. Like, are we going to end up worshiping bioreactors with fungal spores and yeast, making the junk in our house? Like, I don't know. That's what it's seeming like. So then how do we talk about that other than say technology is engineering? But then who is doing the engineering? Is this an evolutionary process of the universe that we're inhabiting? Do we have say over it? Is it something that's a powerful energetic field? I mean, for me, in terms of thinking about like second law of thermodynamics and entropy, people tend to coalesce around different stories and self-reinforce that. And there's a clip in the Sarah Walker playlist about Substack and autocatalytic systems being stacks. And I'm like, that's what Substack is. It's an autocatalytic system.
So you can think of objects in assembly theory as basically recursive stacks of the construction steps to build them.
And I'm kind of throwing out to Sean and Steffers, are we like the chaos agents because we're seeking novelty? And in seeking novelty, we choose not to get looped into a reinforcement loop of a certain team? I don't know. And so like, I'm not committing on that yet. I have to think about it some more. So here, I will read you my one sentence summary. Okay, so if you're trying to pin me down to one sentence, this is, I guess, what it would be in the moment. And this was before the whole Sarah Walker sort of work, which isn't totally new, but it really helped me think more about the idea of us as megastructures with causal histories to access. So there's a lot more that's fitting into this omega point conversation and information fields and genetic algorithms. But so this part doesn't have that. My response to, give me a sentence on your recent research, is it plugging a microbiome into a Hivemind? Like, it's more complicated. So my response was tagged archetypal cybernetic avatars. Tagged archetypal cybernetic avatars team up and forage for contextualized information. And that's qualia, which is an idea that Steffer's brought to my attention, like personally contextualized information. In an interdimensional, air quotes, space, bring said information back to be collectively processed or composted in a globally networked gut brain, managed through precision nutrition that in turn uses quorum sensing to adjust the topological game board and perform some form of collective calculation or puzzle solving that has been delegated to our embodied distributed intelligence from some source, maybe outside of our space-time framework. Okay, so I'll just sort of break that up. So I think the idea of digital twins is that we have a different social physics from who we are in material reality, and that as we interact online, we build up a cartoon, really, of who we are, and again, the online spaces really, try to get people to agree to become cartoons of themselves. And all of the data that builds you up and how you interact with the stacks is tagging, right? And so there's various, categories that get further refined with the hashtags and how you engage with digital media online. And then you have a cybernetic counterpart that can go into information space in ways that your physical body can't. And so think about the adventuring squirrels and cardinals that they're going to forage for information. So there's some quest and you go and you get information. Now you may not know exactly it's like a need to know basis, why you're getting the information or what the purpose is behind it, but you go into information space, which I think is different from our five senses reality space. And how you get there, whether that's through meditative practice, whether that's through microdosing, whether that's through forest bathing, you're getting into some other information field. And I think some of that may be being in touch with the elementals, which is why you have like the fairy house, which is next to the treehouse, and all of the quartz crystals, is there may be energetic information fields that you're engaging with as you gather information. But the information you gather as an individual isn't enough. It has to be compiled. So that's the octopus tentacles, that there's this compiled sensing of all the environmental conditions that are brought back into a common space, like a crucible. And that's like the basin, the water of the squirrel tree trunk, right? It's brought back, or like the cardinal's nest. And then there it can be processed and integrated together. Now I think, and this is just my inclination, my hypothesis, that our microbiome and the little creatures that live in us and on us have a different access to information fields than we do in our regular conscious reality, right? So your subconscious, your gut instinct, your intuition, that's coming from the quantum field of these little creatures, like the bacteria and the fungi and the other things that you cohabit your body with. And so imagine that those gut microbiomes can be networked through some sort of entanglement or through some sort of sensing frequency technology, through some sort of entrainment. And I think that's where Steffer's work into the engineered nanoparticles comes into. And then to get into that gut microbiome, you need to manage the food system, right? But you're going to create a storyline that people will want to have their food system managed for wellness, right? And then you've got Nicole Shanahan's AI prescribed wellness systems. And then you have all of the biohackers who are going to prescribe your wellness. And then you have the quantified self with, all of the biosensors. And then maybe it's not going to look like an Apple Watch or these things that are monitoring you. It's simply going to be the biosensors that are part of the biochar that are in the soil permaculture that are going to be the alternative to the bad organic, because they've wrecked organic and now we're going to come up with a new version that's more organic. And it's, just by the way, we're going to have natural biosensors that can keep everything attuned, right? And so that we can get your guts attuned with one another, right? And and I think this is going to be children, and this is part of like the free lunch program in the schools and getting everyone on the same ground. Well, I don't think you're going to get all the same food, but the kids might be like, you need to eat an apple today, you need to eat some kale, you need to eat this, and it will all be based on the sensing interaction in the gut biome. So you're grooming, you're cultivating that gut biome, but to actually have it networked energetically. And that somehow the processing through that collective, that common ground, will create an energetic frequency that might adjust the topology of the game board or the sense of flow, which is Alicia Guerrero in the complexity system. You don't want to force something when you can simply change the landscape and make the thing you want to happen more likely to happen by changing, like lifting some parts up and some parts down. So imagine the information that you're projecting out through this connected gut sense is changing the reality as we understand it, either in cyberspace or through sensors and actuators through real space, and that may be coming through your UBI or how you can use these community currencies. And that these changes that are underway, if there's something that's outside of our time scale, there's something that might not look like any sort of immediate data gathering situation, but at a different time scale, it's actually performing computation. That our lived experience in a dynamic game board with spatial computing and ubiquitous sensing and socio-technical cyber-physical systems is the computation. And it is a computation in a complex system. And so that's my hypothesis of what may be happening. And again, I've changed so much over time because you don't know what you don't know. And then you get new information and you incorporate it and then you move forward with the new information. And for me, for the most part, there are a few instances where I get new information and it totally wipes something off the board. It's more like this and, like yes, that, and this, right? And then there's another layer to the onion. But if what you want to imagine is that like the Georgia Guidestone deep state version of the stories that people are telling, at a foundational level, that is inconsistent with the information that I'm presenting. It's foundationally inconsistent. And in many ways, that story is going to line you up for Bobby and Nicole's AI blockchain government for human potential optimization, right? But the thing is, if you're on the team Bobby, you're not going to mind playing that game. Like you're not going to mind playing the network gut brain game because you've chosen that, right? And that's where you're comfortable. So I'm not here to tell you like you're bad for choosing that, but just be aware that it's all a game. And I'm not saying I'm out of the game. I'm in the game too. And I'm not trying to invite you into the, Marshall McLuhan Omega Point biocomputation, Aristotelian drama LARPy game of, biological computing. That's just where I'm at now. Like the view from where I'm sitting now, that looks kind of like the landscape that we're dealing with. And then how do we navigate through that landscape? I'm going to just take a minute and sort of like give you a couple of quick highlights on the two playlists that I put together. And then I'm going to go out for a walk. Okay, I'll just say a few things about this interview with Ian Carroll and Nicole Shanahan. I did an initial breakdown of what I thought about his like teaser lead-in for the interview, but this is my chunks from the interview itself. It was about an hour long, and there's 13 videos. They're pretty short, usually under 2 or 3 minutes each. And so I'll just hit the highlights. Again, she's talking about the primacy of Bitcoin and all of this. And so, again, in retrospect, I can see the pushback against me on understanding blockchain as something way more than a financial system. But this is a system of evolution, right? If you look at the Institute for the Future and their plans for blockchain from 2017 to 2027, a key feature of this is this plantoid, which is turning an artificial intelligence into a living, reproducing system. And that's what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is about signal coordination of collective behaviors towards a new evolving type of networked informational life form, really, the superorganism. And so that's what Bitcoin is. And, for anyone who just wants to sit here and keep telling you that it's money, it's not. It's about signal coordination. There was a section here where she's talking about the intellectual her background in intellectual property law. I'm trying to remember because there was the month that was a total blur of me driving down the U-Hauls 3 or 4 times to Arkansas. And so I listened to a number of audiobooks, and one of them was Anathem by Neil Stephenson, and the other one was the second book, it's like Deep Forest or something by Cixin Liu, The 3-Body Problem, the second book. And it was one or the other of the books, but there was a character set. It wasn't a very big character set, but there was like a group in one of those 2 storylines that was a group that was sort of tapped. I think it was Anathem, actually, that was tapped to remember, to hold on to the informational memory of ideas. And so whenever anyone came up with a new idea, they had the legacy information to trace that idea all the way back. And so that's when Nicole is setting up AI tracking systems of patent law and intellectual property law. It is this idea of intellectual idea evolution. And that's something that's been like standing for a long time, the evolution of ideas. She is very much about, we have to understand the deep state corruption of the government is to set up AI governance systems, cybernetic governance systems in the name of efficiency and speed of transactions. And so I guess the time she spent at Stanford, she was looking at transaction costs, which again, Bitcoin is supposed to be really good at. And we have to understand that the transaction is really like a communication exchange within the global communication organism. And so the transaction costs have to be really low because it's almost like a cell-to-cell communication. You have to have so many bazillion ones to coordinate a global technosphere that you can't have high transactions. It's not really about money, it's about the signal. And so they have to get a really, really low cost of the transactions in order to do the coordinating at a global scale. So her work in Coase theorem, transaction costs, is related to that. She's really pushing this idea of getting rid of legacy governance systems, right? Which is like elected officials and substituting a blockchain, AI, token engineering, crypto economic governance systems. Now they're going to sell it to you as commoning, right? And they're going to sell it to libertarians and the left and the right as like, oh, you get to decide the goals for the policies. But I have a lot of concerns about this. This is going into futarchy and Jeffrey Yass and having betting markets on policy outcomes and cybernetics, and then again feedback loops from real-time data on social policy. A lot of this is linked to poverty management and social impact metrics and digital identity. So we really don't have enough of an understanding to move forward on this. But Nicole and Bobby are full speed ahead on AI government. And like I would just ask, the people in Texas, are you guys ready just to like throw out your elected government officials and install a blockchain AI system? Because that's what they're calling for. That's really what they're calling for, and that's what the government essentially is making itself obsolete as we speak, in places like Texas, which are the lead in all of this. I think it's important to notice that she mentioned that Vitalik Buterin, before he made his public coming out, that he came to one of her conferences rolling around on one of those, telerobots, and that she is one of the early adopters of Ethereum. So she definitely knows about the smart contracting, which is central to token engineering around social policy. And I'm sure she must know Glenn Weil and the Radical Exchange Group because they're operating in Oakland, and so that's where she's from, and she knows the Oakland policy space. There was a weird video where she's talking a lot about the importance of common sense science and the science of well-being, and even verging into spirituality at the end. And so I was like, that seems like an imprint of that term, common sense. She repeats it a lot in that clip. And when I look up Thomas Paine, who created common sense, it's kind of looking through his history, which there's a lot going on with Thomas Paine. He's a deist and other things. And there was some question about if he was a Freemason, but he did write an essay on the origins of Freemasonry in Druid culture. And it's quite interesting because, again, she and her new partner, Jacob, did this hand tying program that was like a Celtic Druid type of, alternate to marriage ceremony, which is interesting for someone who's a lawyer to not do the legal version, but to do like a Druid Celtic bonding ritual. And the Freemasons have these types of Druids, and she's promoting common sense. Now, I would say please listen to that clip, because when you do, you realize she's talking about like clearing out the noise and just being common sense about things. But what is common sense? Is common sense consensus reality? Because if that's what you mean by common sense, which she doesn't really define, then all of the stuff leading into the lockdown culture, for the majority of people, that would be common sense. Right? So who gets to decide what is common sense? Is that the AI? And then who is programming the AI? So that I have a lot of concerns. She mentions about bureaucratic government. She uses an example of a housing program for returning citizens for ex-offenders in Oakland and how many hoops you have to jump through. Well, that's social impact policy. That's pay for success. And the Department of Justice and HUD and the Department of Justice have been working on pay for success housing for a really long time. And they're working on getting all the ex-offenders to do coding for cut rate wages. And so that's what they need to build the technosphere, is all the poor people who can't get other jobs to be put into smart housing and then to code this thing into reality. There's also a mention of the fact that her patent law firm, the company that she founded, was using AI machine learning on the patents in biotech to develop a compendium of molecules, all kinds of molecules across all of these different patents, which to my way of thinking is a language. Like these molecular components are about a language of creating self-generating autocatalytic systems of new kinds of networked informational life. And that's the Sarah Walker piece, is how life comes into being through information. And so the molecules of biotech are about that. It's not just about coming up with improved treatment protocols. And then finally, then they go all gaga about the soil, right? And the living soil and the importance of the soil. You know, some stuff has been coming through to me lately about they're guiding the narrative. They're bringing it back around that it's not going to be about climate. It's going to be about pollution. We have to clean our water and clean our soils. And how are we going to do that? Well, I suspect we're going to have graphene, and the graphene is going to be a sensing mechanism and maybe also a programming mechanism for the water, for structured water. To what end? Like, what is the nature of the programming if we're running everything through AI and blockchain? So those are my thoughts on the Ian Carroll interview with Shanahan, and I'll put a link to those clips so that you can listen to them for yourself. But these are the key things. It is very significant that she has been in on the ground floor of smart contracts in Ethereum and is pushing automated governance. I mean, I wrote, and I can link into this maybe I'll throw this into a blog post, a whole blog post about NAMSHUBs, and this will be an entry to the Sarah Walker talk with Neil Stevenson, who created the term the metaverse. He wrote a book called The Snow Crash, which was about a mind virus. And it was based on the idea of a Sumerian language with magical force, a NAMSHUB, the NAMSHUB of Enki. And that was centered to this plot, which is interesting because my friend Lynn had forwarded me a clip of a state legislator in Texas, in the Houston area, who was promoting open education resources as a Bible, the importance of that for biblical teaching. And in Snow Crash, one of the main sort of villains was a cable TV mogul who was working in televangelism, who had funded a bunch of archaeological projects in Sumeria, and then was developing antenna head people and used glossolalia, like the Pentecostal speaking in tongues. So there are all of these like weird things that are like both in books, maybe from 30 years ago, and then seeming to have sort of resonance with unfolding events now, about using language to have mind viruses to structure people in certain ways. But anyway, so this article about the NAMSHUB of Enki, at the end, it was talking about Bettina Warburg, and she was promoting vending machine government. And, I'll link to that. But what Nicole Shanahan is doing is promoting the exact same thing as Bettina Warburg of the Warburg banking family, which is vending machine government for efficiency. So, if you're considering supporting this candidacy with your time or your vote or your money, just get clear on what they're actually offering you, because what happens when you hook the vending machine government up to biochar organic soil sensors and consciousness in your gut microbiome? It gets a little messy. Okay, and I'll just give a few things. I have this one. So Lex Friedman his podcasts are as long as mine. This one was super long. Well, it's not super long, but it was like 3 hours. And so I chunked it down to about an hour, but I organized it in a way that hopefully you will find useful. So this is with Sarah Walker. Again, I mentioned she's an astrobiologist from Arizona State University. And, to be honest, I I enjoyed listening to Sarah because she likes ideas. And so I'm not saying this in terms of a judgmental way. I mean, we're not exactly on the same wavelength because she admits to being a physicalist. And so being a physicalist who several times says, like, in order for theoretical physicists to not go crazy, they have to ground themselves in reality and science. And so I'm not so worried about the crazy part because I think that there's some aspect of physicalism that is important in the embodied consciousness, but then there are other aspects that are more metaphysical, relating to digital twins and having a counterpart that can interface with information fields differently than the physical body, that can go into these other domains, right? That are not available to you while you're sitting here, as crystallized water, and that you're tethered to that other person through your soul, and also your gut microbiome that may have quantum access properties is also tethered into you. So there are different mechanisms of sensing information that are not just limited to the five senses or the other people who might have more extrasensory perception in the physical body, that these twins that they're in the process of developing at a population scale have different physics. And to me, those physics, if you want to call it that, do have a mystical, a spiritual, a metaphysical property to them. And it's very much connected to the soul, which again, if you look at the squirrel basin, you've got the salamander, which is the soul, and teleki, connected. So I think the soul part, you've got the physical part, and then you've got the soul part, and they're connected and tethered. And I think that the Bitcoin and the Tether and the stable coin is a reflection of that tethering system. So we don't agree on all points, but she has raised a lot of questions that I think help expand some of the things that I've been thinking about. So early on, she talks, well, actually, these aren't in chronological order. I made all the clips and then I put them in an order that made sense to me. So if you're going to look at the clips, I would recommend looking at the playlist order and not just the order that they show up in my video feed, because that's a little bit more hodgepodge. So I started with the fact that she and Lex are commiserating that we kind of like to be traumatized by new information. And a lot of us, we were sort of commiserating that you're like, we're right. We really do like to learn new things. But every time you learn something new, it's difficult to process because then you have to revisit all the things you thought you knew and realize you didn't really know them that well, or you have to let things go. And sometimes they're overwhelming or they can be perceived as scary, and that we kind of traumatize ourselves. But we often reinforce the trauma because then we want to go and learn the next new thing. And so those of us who are doing this kind of exploration, if you're on this channel, you probably are that kind of person too. There is this sort of, how do you navigate this thing that you sort of enjoy traumatizing yourself with new information that unsettles your worldview. So I like that about Sarah. She talks about everything being inside the universe and this idea of space and time, that a lot of her stuff is connected to assembly theory and Lee Cronin, and I need to go back and spend some time looking into his work. They collaborate. But this idea of system stacking. And so again, she would say, we are each individually small in physical space, but giant in time. And we don't have a perception or a language to talk about the giant aspect of time, that, we can trace our lineages all the way back to the Big Bang. And then we're constantly branching off. So the tiny little branch that is us still has access to this vast amount of flow of knowledge that came before us. And I think that's why we're needed biologically, is that whatever the system is that's seeking to put us in a game and use our crystalline nature to get information out and to coordinate and compost information and get some sort of puzzle solving thing out of it, it's connected to our ability to access the field and to our lineages. And so I think that's a really interesting idea to play around with. And that the more time that gets packed into this universe that we're in, that we can recognize that it becomes more and more compressed because the space is fixed and the time keeps getting bigger, so it keeps getting compressed. And in that compression, it's almost the virtualization is required. And so she talks about it like the technosphere is a result of this vast amount of time being compressed into a fixed space that becomes virtualized almost like a black hole. Now, I'm not judging good or bad, and I'm not saying the technosphere is good or bad, but I'm saying that's an interesting idea, how we play with space and how we play with time, and that virtualization may be a reflection of deep abstracted time and the way in which it becomes represented in our physical reality. Then she talks about the earth as one living thing, which is this omega point, right, is the noosphere, which is the biosphere, the Vernadsky, the Teilhard de Chardin. And we can debate back and forth whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I think the network of Web3 blockchain, it's moving forward. So we have to kind of acknowledge it. So her framework is that the earth is one big thing, and that the evolution of the earth is not happening as an individual level, but is happening at a social level. So with the exception that our microbiome may evolve over the course of our life, we individually don't evolve, but our societies evolve, and that we evolve in coordination with our technologies. And so we need to consider them all in context. And so I thought that actually there was merit in that idea, like that we are an integrated system, that the technologies are not separate from us, they are an extension of us, and that we are embedded in our environment. Our environment is both built up of our social relationships, our relationships with the built environment, our relationships with the natural environment, our relationships with technology. We're not in a vacuum. And so us as being represented are surrounded by a constellation of context, which again goes back to qualia, that you can't really separate the person from the backdrop and the lived experience that brought them to that point, which I think makes sense. And again, I'm starting to think that blockchain is part of recording all of that contextual information. So then there's a lot that she goes into that's about, like, I think relates to Claude Shannon and information theory. And this idea that there may be this thing emerging that is a new kind of information organism, whether you want to say it's alive or not. That's her big academic question, is what is the origin of life? What is the boundary at which life starts? Is there a new thing underway? And she kind of says that there is this new thing underway that's on a scale that's as big as like the shift from chemistry to biology, which is, Vernadsky, the biogeochemistry. How do we get from chemistry to a life, right? And as spiritual people, like you imagine like a soul is attached into that. But from a scientific and physics standpoint, that shift from chemistry to biology, like maybe it's biology to information, and that we're living this right now. We're on this roller coaster. And in building this, it's all small units. So she and Lee Cronin have done research that says there's these units that life has to resist entropy. So you have to be able to hold your pattern against the forces that are looking to deconstruct the pattern. So you have to be able to be, and then to persist in being, and then reproduce your beingness in order to count as life. And so they're looking at like, it takes 15 steps to have these recursive modules that can then hold a pattern. Now, I will say in reading the Enderverse books that this idea of phylotes and holding patterns, and Jane, the AI, holding patterns of things in the outside, this idea of holding one's pattern is sort of pervasive throughout the world building exercise of Orson Scott Card in the Enderverse books. So it's interesting to think about, she and Cronin are talking about something called assembly theory, that a thing is built up of all of the steps that it takes to get to that thing. And in order for that thing to be alive, it has to build itself through often self-referential models, which is, again, these autocatalytic sets, which is cybernetics. But I think from information theory, it's also this biosemiotics, which is something, people have brought up, Hanging Thief and someone else in a comment, and a couple people, this C.S. Pierce and Terrence Deacon, this idea of information, self-reinforcing information, cybernetic information, nested systems that reinforce one another and then hold on to identity. That this is part of this assembly theory. And there's like one line, I think it's only 7 seconds long here, assembly theory, objects and recursive stacks. So she's talking about stacking and unstacking. And I'm like, I think that's the source of the name of Substacks, is that those online digital spaces are emergent informational organisms. And, Bentov talks about us being information organizers. So, is there something to an idea of a self-constructing system of information that exists, like maybe without a soul? Is it a golem? Again, I'm not sure. I'm not trying to judge and say it's a this and I'm scared of that or I'm mad about that or whatever. I'm just exploring what these ideas are, because I think that the social media sphere is in information organizing and creating space, where they are playing with this idea of assembly theory and modularity and autocatalytic systems. And so when you're participating in comment sections with people that you know as avatars online, and you have these relationalities, and the Substacks are self-referential and self-supporting, and some of them are even the same people with different names, that they're kind of playing with this idea of these emergent autocatalytic systems. So she talks about the importance of patterning. And again, that's this deep history, is holding your pattern. Now, Julia Stulman, who was, someone I looked into much earlier with the Foundation for Integrated Education, and Fritz Kunst. Now, remember, Stulman was a lumber guy. So we're back to forests and lumber, and Kunst was the theosophist. But Julia Stulman gave this talk at Earlham College, which is a Quaker college, I think, in Indiana, where his papers are about the pattern of life. And then I think we can think about pattern in terms of Levin and electrical blueprints and morphic fields. And so how does the pattern hold? How does it get assembled, and how does it hold? Now, she also talks about the importance of randomness and all of that. So I think the randomness is, again, how do we integrate a bunch of preschoolers into this? Like, that's pretty random. If you want randomness at the bottom in terms of exploring behaviors, maybe preschoolers and people with dementia, those are pretty random things, right? They don't fit the existing system. So therefore, those are like randomness generators. And then from there on, you try to start to build up the modules. She's talking about the fact that she thinks the origin of life has an abrupt phase transition. Now, there were some sections in there where they were talking about Schrodinger's equation, the cat's alive, the cat's dead. But he was positing that life came out of information storage related to aperiodicity in crystals. So aperiodic crystals, like a icosahedron, which is the structure of water. And so there's some really interesting things about aperiodic crystals and water and information theory. So I think that's kind of interesting. And then they get into a lot of the stuff about language, which I think is kind of connected to NAMSHUBs and mind viruses, and like how things are happening online. And again, how things are changing us relationally with one another. How the teams, it's very important. My hypothesis now is that it's not just one cardinal going out on an expedition to bring stuff back and examine things in their nest. It's the cardinal and the squirrel. It's the teaming. And again, that's the project-based learning in the OER, is that they're going to set up digital teams. And that's why we need digital twins, is that the teams will be pulling from consciousnesses these cloud minds from all over the world. And then they're going to come up with like natural language translation bridging mechanisms. And some of those teams might even include non-human intelligences, which might be engineered. They might be some strange translational representation of animal intelligence or plant intelligence, interpreting Cleve Baxter. There's a lot of people who are doing digital sound, acoustic sounds of plants. And I can see them imagining that as a language, working in synesthesia, which is something that she mentioned. So I think that the idea of alternate forms of communication and language. And then we have humans as artifacts to access deep time. So there were a couple of parts of the discussion that seemed kind of random in this conversation. One of them was about fashion. And it's interesting that she's wearing yellow, because I think yellow is alchemically related to the soul. But she talks about playing around with fashion almost like a language and being playful about it, and that it sort of shows your identity and your social relationships. And so I do think it's important to think of that as a language. And this idea of artifacts, because again, my background is in cultural landscape and art history and historic preservation and stuff, material culture. And so if you imagine that an artifact is like an encapsulated linguistic construct, because they're going back and forth about the challenges of communicating these ideas. And so I would say like that fountain with the squirrel and those two sculptures, the squirrel and the cardinal, those were artifacts that then opened up this entire landscape for me. Like, it was a key that then gave me a view or catalyzed a thought process that was like a cascade. And she talks a little bit about that, about life, like hitting a certain point and then like cascading out, reaching a certain threshold. And then it happens kind of abruptly. And so, again, I don't know what it was about me going to the Botanic Garden and then having this backstory of lumber and biochar and the Anthony family too, the lumber family, they're working with this graphite company in Pine Bluff, which is funded by the Bill Gates Breakthrough Energy Foundation. And they're somehow dehydrating or compressing sawdust to the point that it has no moisture and no microbes, and then sealing it and burying it underground for carbon trading. And to me, that seems like there's just way more to that story. That doesn't really make a lot of sense why you wouldn't just reuse the waste in some other purpose, like compost it or put it in some building materials or something else. Like, to me, it almost feels like a fungal substrate, like a sterilized fungal substrate. So why are they putting all that underground? Like, are they waiting for some big fungal emergence at some point in Pine Bluff? But does Anthony, yeah. So there's all, like, having all of this backstory, and again, the heart hospital and graphene light-based pacemakers, and you know, in the fairy village, and then the treehouse and the water. And I did see a bald eagle, my 2 animal sightings that day. I saw a bald eagle at the end and a little turtle. So it's like Feynman turtles all the way down. But yeah, it catalyzed a lot of thoughts. So I think this idea of digital artifacts is really important as a language, as a NAMSHUB even. And then using, if you think about like quantum dots or things that are used in imaging, if you can tag digital artifacts, creative artifacts that are embedded, that have deep meaning in them, and then track how they move throughout the social relations in the world and how people interact with them as sort of a digital superorganism, that's a language, and it conveys sort of the state change of the organism as a whole as it relates to, you know, homeostasis or well-being or processing. So I think that this idea of artifacts is important, that the digital twin of us might be an artifact representing this deep history that we have going back, and that there might be something outside of our space-time perspective that would want to access that, both our consciousness aspect and our biology aspect, and then our lineage aspect. So yeah, so she talks about humans as artifacts, this idea of deep time, that again, she imagines there's all of these branched structures, and she's not a big fan of the many worlds theory, which I kind of actually like, the Hugh Everett, but she did sort of say that if you folded up all of the branchings off of a particular person, you could fold them up, that could all be sort of representative of you as an artifact. And that to me sort of feels right, in that in your tethered informational version, you could go in and explore other versions of you and bring back information. You might not be able to go in to live and occupy that body and that reality, but that you could tap into those alternate futures for, you know, problem solving. And this is part of my essay that I wrote. Sean had brought my attention to John Rogers, who was the Defense Department guy who was working with the entertainment industry, and Michaela Ulliorou and the Les Ciel Foundation. This idea of mixed table problem solving, that you would want people with different perspectives to come in and solve problems. But imagine if you could have a digital twin and then dip into all of the other alternative realities of yourself and then bring that to the table for the computational exercise. The other thing that's interesting is this idea of accessing the adjacent possible, which is something I had in one of my network state maps with whatever, Srinivasian or whatever, the network state. There was this idea of accessing, you bring together an eclectic group, and then what's adjacent to that network is what is most likely to happen. So what she's talking about is exploring alternative futures, and that there's like a vast amount of information space. Every step you take out, that it gets exponentially much greater. And so really you can only bring into being things that are adjacent, that are not too far distant. And so I would think this idea of a mixed table or a mixed intelligence would give you most access to an interesting adjacent possible, to realize or materialize certain information fields into the reality that we're currently occupying. Yeah, so she talks about kinds of life, language being a kind of life, or math being a kind of life. I really do think that they would imagine that Web3 spatial computing is a kind of life, like these reinforcing systems, and especially if pattern holding against entropy is part of it, and then holding your pattern against with a goal-oriented behavior, which is cybernetics, and having recursive loops built in. I think that's what the token engineering is for. And that, again, melds into the human potential movement and, you know, the Barbara Marx Hubbard, and going back to SRI, and you could go all the way back to eugenics. This idea of using technology to create state, remembering the state of play, and then doing it again and doing it again and doing it again against a certain goal in a certain fitness landscape. It's not that different, I think, from people who play video games, and then you remember the state of play of your game. And then the AI builds on that for the next round of play. It learns towards getting towards a certain goal. I think that this is all connected. But could the blockchain itself be a language? When I was looking at the woman who was from Arise, and she was showing sort of the visualization, data visualization of the fungal interactions across time in sort of a 3D model, that reminded me, I think Sean brought up Neri Oxman's orbs, like she was representing data visualizations, almost like fancy glass paperweights, right, that are very organic. And that artifact, again, as an artifact, was compressed information to be decoded. And so, yeah, so what if these ledger data sets somehow become an artifactual language? And then what happens if maybe you don't even need the actual physical paperweight glass thing? You just have a digital version and it gets passed around. It's interesting to think about. So she's talking, they're talking a lot about the challenge of using language to describe something we don't really have language for, which again, I thought, Stephen Newcomb's book did that very well. Like he's very good with the linguistic analysis. And yeah, if you don't have words for something, how do you talk about it? And it's going to be trial and error. And then the challenge is people may misinterpret you because they don't, a lot of words, and we've seen this over and over again, wellness, what do we mean by that? Is my version of wellness the same as your version of wellness? Like, we don't have a common ground. It's hard to have a conversation. There's room for a lot of misunderstanding or manipulation. So again, this idea of fashion could be a language. There was another discussion of, she had a graduate student working on bioluminescence with fireflies, and that as a language, like using bio-inspired design as a language of light. And so I think that's a huge thing that connects into a lot of work that Steffers has been doing, and that intersects with what we've been looking into with photonics and optics and bioluminescence and fungi and photon capture and photosynthesis. Like the light as a language is super duper important. Yeah, I think that's sort of most of it. And at the end, she just talks about like she kind of likes pushing boundaries and that she finds a lot of satisfaction in that, which, goes back to like liking being traumatized. And I think that's the thing that I sort of vibed with her, is that Neri Oxman is like a very cool character, and Sarah strikes me as a little bit more of a nerd, and she would probably like that someone is engaging with her material, because her goal is to engage with the ideas. So I'd like to engage with some of these ideas about like, what would it be to be a digital, humans represented as digital artifacts in deep time, used computationally in spatial computing and with resonant crystallography and light and entrainment and these engineered nanoparticles. And then how does that fit with the Nicole Shanahan and her, AI managed wellness and, graphene enabled, pollution systems, and Bobby and his river keeping, and, icosahedron and JD Bernal and crystallography. There are a lot of things to talk about. I think a lot of people just want to pin it down. Like, it's blockchain, right? It's graphene, right? And I'm like, I don't know. Like the whole graphene thing, if you told me when I started out and I was like railing against Chromebooks that it was going to be organic, vegan, anti-cruelty, vegan leather kombucha slippers that were reporting back on like the energy meridians on the children's feet while they were forest bathing, I would never have believed you, right? So, shame on me if I don't learn that lesson. I don't know. I'm still exploring this space. And I have to believe that there is something benevolent out in the world. Like I do believe, everybody has their own spiritual practice. I do believe that there is a guiding force of love behind all of this, and that there's maybe some celebration in us exploring with an open, good heart, even in the face of difficult adversity. So just like be mindful if you end up trying to like traumatize yourself, because we all tend to do that. Those of us who are on this path, we do tend to like self-traumatize. So anyway, so I think that's probably all I've got to say on this for the time being. I was not expecting to tie together a children's garden squirrel sculpture with fungal computing and deep history artifacts in alternative linguistic structures and AI intellectual property, vice presidential candidates working on, giving us a vending machine government for our spiritual well-being. But that seems to be where I've landed this week. So thanks for tuning in, and until next time.